In this video, we're going to continue on with our data manipulation journey, so to speak, and we're going to work with tidyr, which is another package for data manipulation. Okay, and its specific job in the tidyverse is to tidy data. So you might have data that's not tidy, it's going to turn it into tidy data. And we actually saw, if you watched to the end of my video the last time, I used the sort of main powerhouse function in tidyr, which is pivot longer, to tidy some data or to get it into a tidier format to work with. So this is a short set of slides, so we should be able to do this. If I can not manage to go on too many tangents, do all of this. So we're going to learn the important functions, pivot wider and pivot longer, and then there are a few other functions that might be of use. So we're going to spend most of our time in pivot wider and pivot longer. Okay, so again, here's the cheat sheet that you may or may not find helpful. Okay, and so here's tidyr. Again, to remind you, the tidyr package is part of the tidyverse. Its main function as a package is to tidy data. The tidy data principles are every column is a variable, every row is an observation, and every cell is a single value. There are 5 main actions that tidyr addresses, and they are pivoting, rectangling, nesting, splitting, and then implicit versus explicit, which we won't really get to, but that's okay. Now, there are many circumstances in which you need to change the shape of your data. Okay, where you'll actually use pivot longer and pivot wider most is in plotting, I think, but we saw it in a grades example before. And so here is another grades example. I have John, Mary, Ben, and Steph, 3 homeworks, 2 tests, and of course their name. And so I want to plot how well the students did over time, which really, I guess, we'll assume that he did homework 1, 2, and 3 first and took 2 tests at the end. We don't really know exactly how it goes, but that's what we'll assume. How do I do that? And I want 1 point per student. It's not gonna work as just that basic way. We need to use pivot longer. It takes data in wide format and gathers it into a long format. Basically, it's going to smush your data horizontally and make it longer vertically. Now, the interesting part of this this action has been through a number of iterations in the tidyverse world, in the world of just R in general. But Hadley Wickham has been creating packages for, 15 years. Now, it's a long time in the in the sort of data science in the R world, really. And it's now in the 3rd iteration of the same function, 3 different names. So it was first called melt, then it was called gather, and now it's called pivot longer. So you probably won't see any melting, but you may see some gather and pivot longer. Melt is actually the verb that data.table uses, which is the main competitor to dplyr, I believe. And so there are reasons for why it would be called melt, but they've gone away from that in tidyr. So, sorry for my bad build-ins. Pivot longer looks like this. There are a lot of arguments to pivot longer, and so I have to list them out here, but there are 4 ones that are of interest that you'll probably use. And they are 1, the data, and 2, the columns, because those are both required arguments. So, of course, it needs the data to pivot it. It needs the data at first, and then it needs the columns. So first, the columns to pivot into a longer format. There are helper functions that can help. So you can either specify all of them by name, or you can say, I want everything, or you can say, I want everything but a column. In my example with the grades, and what you'll see in just a second, I often use the not a column version because I think it's probably most simple or makes the most sense in many of the cases. And then there's names to and values to. When you pivot longer, depending on how many columns that you don't pivot on, if there's one column you don't pivot on, you'll create 3 columns. If there are 2 columns you don't pivot on, you'll create 4 columns, so on and so forth. I'm sorry. Again, bad build-ins. So if I take my tibble, which I've defined there on the left, and I pivot longer, I say minus name, names to assignment, values to grades, which is very similar to what I did in my last video. The names to, basically what's going to happen is all of the column names that you say that you want to pivot, that are getting pivoted, they become their own column, and that's the names column. And so you have to define what do you want that column to be called. That's the names to. And then the values, which in this case here are what's inside of the data frame at the moment. The homework scores or the test scores, the actual numbers, those are the values. And so what do you want them to be called? They get their own column. And you want them to be called, well, in this case, grades. Okay? And so this is what you get. So the names are repeated. The homeworks, so for how many columns, for however many columns you pivot, the name is going to be repeated that many times. So here 5 times. The assignments are listed out. Homework 1, homework 2, homework 3, test 1, test 2, and then the values. So name, assignment, grade. Name is left because in the pivot longer specification up above, I said minus name, which is a lot. And of course, I don't want to pivot the name. I don't want, name is not like another homework or assignment or another test assignment, so it's separate from that. It's the identifier of the row at the moment, and so I don't want to pivot the identifier of the row. Okay. Now, pivot wider is the opposite. It goes from a long format back to a wide format. It also went through 3 iterations, melt and decast. So melt and cast, sort of like blacksmith-ish terms. Spread, it was melt and decast, then it was gather and spread. Now it's pivot wider and pivot longer. The names, if you're interested, come from Excel. So Excel has pivot tables, which do this same thing. And so the names are taken or inspired from Excel. It's the inverse of pivot longer. Now, I have that data set we'll call TB2 that I just took and just made using pivot longer, and I want to go backwards. So you go backwards, you say where do I want the names of the columns to be from? I want them to be from assignment. And where do I want the values to come from? I want them to come from grade. And I get back what I started with. So pivot wider and pivot longer are going to pivot. I use longer much more commonly than wider. Okay. Now, there are helper functions called pivot longer spec. So you can create some very intricate pivots for various situations that it might be a very long function call if you do it just like we did. And there are some helper functions that can help you make a longer specification. And if you want to check them out, you can click that link there. Okay. But then we come to hoist and unnest. So these functions have to do with lists. Lists are the most basic data structure in R. They're very powerful and then can also be a pain in the butt, as many of these things can be. And lists are not tidy data friendly because they can contain more than one thing. In fact, an entire column of a data set can be a list, as we have here. And it's just a real big pain to work with. And so hoist and unnest can help us. So hoist, unnest longer, unnest wider are variants that provide tools for rectangling or collapsing deeply nested lists into tidy tibbles. I'm not going to go over too much what hoist and unnest do because we're not going to really use it much. I'm not going to, if I get anything, if I want you to use any data set that has what's called a list column, I will just unnest it myself, unless I want you to do something specific with it. So I'm going to skip over these. They're powerful, but it's just not something that we're going to have to worry about very much in this class. But I do give you some examples of what that might look like here. Okay. So hoist, nest, can make a list column. Hoist brings it out of a list column, and so on and so forth. Okay, and so that's where we'll end this one. Pivot longer and pivot wider are really what you need to use most often from tidyr. And so hopefully that puts into context what I did at the end of the last video a little bit more.